So, welcome. I am really, really delighted to welcome you today, Steve. You don't need an introduction, but for anyone who is new to Steve, Steve's been digging around this world of evolution and human values and culture and consciousness for decades, really. And your books include Integral Consciousness and the Future of Evolution, Evolution's Purpose, Developmental Politics. And I think you have a new book that you're working on called Truth Emerging, a forthcoming book. And you're also the CEO, co founder of the Institute for Developmental Philosophy. Really intrigued to hear what you will share with us today, Steve. Over to you.
Thanks to Molly, and thanks everyone for coming to our little session this morning. Saturday morning is usually not when I present, but I'm really glad to be able to be here today. And I want to share this paper, Fostering Evolution in Islamic Societies. This was originally published or written in 2015. It was right after the attacks of the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris. Jeff Salzman, who I see on the call today, thanks for coming, Jeff. We talked about this quite a bit, and we both, I think, concluded that this integral perspective, or developmental perspective, as I most often call it now, can shed some light on the problem of militant Islamism. Right. So the problem's not Islam, the religion, so much as it is this militaristic expression of it, which, to make it, just to make the problem clear, the problem of ISIS, the Islamic State, and their radicalism and lone wolf attacks like we continue to see here in the US and all over the world. There are other militant groups, there's other forms of war. And so I'm not trying to isolate this, but I knew that this was not just an Islamic problem, it was everybody's problem because all the worldviews were contributing to it. And so the task was to bring some integral light to the problem of, violent terrorism. And so I began in 2015 to spend some time with Islamic literature, the literature of Islamic scholars, the majority of which is written by modernists, Islamic modernists from various Islamic countries who have undertaken what they, sort of call, that they all kind of agree on the terminology of Islam's predicament with modernity is actually how they frame it. Their analysis it consists of various versions of how Islam could go through a reformation, like Christianity has, like Judaism has, like Hinduism has, like Buddhism has, like all these other world religions have been able to at least accommodate the tensions that naturally exist between secular modernity and their religious worldview. But Islam is in some ways more resistant to modernity than these other world religions. And so hence, for the last 150 years, there have been Islamic intellectuals who've proposed various strategies to try to at least harmonize or reduce the tensions between, the Ummah and the growing globalizing culture of modernity. And so in addition to studying the literature for several months, the Institute for Developmental Philosophy also hosted two prominent modernist Islamic scholars, Shireen Hunter and Nader Hashemi. Shireen Hunter was a professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University and a leading figure. And Nader Hashemi, he was director of the University of Denver Center for Middle Eastern Studies. So these are credible scholars. They both are, in a sense, partisans of Islam, deeply devoted to it. But at the same time, part of their scholarly mission is to help integrate it better with the rest of the globalizing secular world. And so we flew Professor Hunter out, and Hashemi was here as well. And we had a panel between me and Michael Zimmerman and those two. And we also did a panel at University of Colorado. So in the day, we did a panel at University of Colorado, and then we did a panel at the Integral Center. And we learned a lot from that, from interacting with them, from reading the literature, and it was around that time that I figured I had enough of at least a glib understanding of the problem to write an article about it. And the article came out in 2015, like I said, and it was pretty well received. We had quite a few comments on the article. Many of the comments were from practicing Muslims and who they really appreciated it. If you haven't looked at the paper, it's certainly not Islamophobic, it's Islamophilic. In other words, at the end, and as I'll explain today, my recommendation is a strategy of love, going beyond just respect, just kind of a multicultural acceptance of Islam, but actually recognizing the best way that we can reduce the tensions, let's say, is to appreciate better love the aspects of Islamic civilization that I think will and can continue to contribute to cultural evolution for centuries to come. In other words, there's 1.6 million practicing Muslims in the world. It's the second largest world religion. Unlike most of the other religions, the majority, the median age of the Muslim populations is very young, right? That they have a giant baby boom that they've experienced over the last few decades, and so we have a lot of restlessness. People are being pulled to modernity. People are being pulled to more severe versions of traditionalism. As I'm talking here, I'm not going to use the colors. I'm just going to talk in terms of traditionalism, modernism, and progressive postmodernism as the three major worldview structures that are contributing. And so, as a kind of a preview of what I'm going to say, I'm not going to recommend or imply that the Islamic world needs to somehow catch up with the West or go through the same developmental trajectory as the West. I think that multicultural sensibilities and cultural relativism deserve to be honored. And so I'll come to that in a moment. I just want to say that, in addition to the contribution, so the problem is militant Islam and its Islamism, I should say, and the ongoing acts of violence and terrorism that are being perpetrated by that restlessness or the fault lines between secular modernity and the traditional Islam. So this is it's a hot button. Talking about Islam, especially with my identity, I just want to acknowledge that there are many different kinds of Islam. I'm not trying to lump it all together kind of unconsciously into one monolithic block. But I think it's important to say that the tensions exist at the micro level, just like the dialectic itself, right? This pattern of evolution, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's fractal. It's occurring at every little conflict we can see. But because it's fractal, these little parts also are kind of representations of the larger whole, like the Mandelbrot set, right? The bug. You go in to the edge, and it's the same pattern. I'm talking about these larger dialectical relationships in world culture at this time in history, but I also want to acknowledge that there are certainly limitations to generalizations and big picture analyses. So I'll kind of just leave it at that. But the fact that this problem is everyone's problem because it affects us all in various ways, and not just each of us individually, it's each of these major worldviews, each of these civilizational segments or value systems are each in their own way contributing to the problem. And so the solution to the problem isn't just a matter of Islam growing into a place where it can better be in harmony with the globalizing modernity. It's how Islam's resistance to modernity we can turn it around. Instead of seeing, a dire, wicked global problem, we can also see it as a golden opportunity because the only way for this problem to be solved is not just for the militant Islamists to grow out of it, maybe not personally, but generationally, but also for modernity and postmodernity to also grow. In other words, what I'm recommending is that this problem can help us all grow together. And so that's kind of the overarching frame of my analysis in this paper. But before I get to the specifics of the paper, I just want to say a few more things about the context in which it arose. After looking at it in what I wrote in 2015, we've just started a new Substack channel, and reread the article and thought, this is aged pretty well. And so I updated it just slightly, and we republished it on Substack, and it seemed to be well received there. And Namali read it and invited me to talk about it here. So, um, you know, every problem is a problem of consciousness, at least partially. And so, this opportunity to think about how consciousness can be raised, both individually and culturally, is a challenge in other words, we begin to see our opportunity to look at raising consciousness as a solution to almost every problem. That comes online with an integral or developmental worldview, right? That is, we can look at every one of these structures and internalize them in a way so that no one is the other, right? We're taking what Teilhard de Chardin called a planetary perspective, right? What's best for humanity as a whole, right? And obviously peace, prosperity, wisdom, knowledge, growth, equality, liberty, prosperity, all of these things, I would say we can perhaps even assert with confidence that these are in the interests of humanity as a whole. Although certainly not everybody is going to have the same trajectory of growth. I'm not suggesting that there's just a linear trajectory that goes from traditional modern to postmodern, even though we can see that as a sequence, right, in the timeline that makes it somewhat linear and in the succession of the emergence. But at the same time, we need to grow together. And in some ways, the challenges that we're experiencing now with these civilizational conflicts are the signals, right? The points of departure that are the opportunities for us to grow together. As I argue in my forthcoming book, at least, again, I'm not going to unpack that argument here, but I'll just assert it, and that is that one of humanity's higher purposes, right? We could maybe identify a set of higher purposes, but at least one of them is to contribute to the further evolution of the noosphere, right? Which means the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of culture, even the evolution of technology and, material civilization. All of these things are elements of noosphere evolution that co-evolve together. And so working for noosphere evolution is, in some ways, my higher purpose, even, in my own small way. And so that's the frame of what how we're approaching a potentially integral solution to the problem of, Islamic terrorism. Islamism. So I just want to I want to keep this in mind. I want to not be verbally lazy and refer to it as Islamism, because although Islam has always been, a political religion, even though conquest and militarism has been a part of this, religious civilization, as well as other, pre-modern religious civilizations. They're not completely unique in that way. The idea that, at least for organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, it's almost like we could say that war is their spiritual practice. That it's sort of the militancy is deeply embedded, and so part of the Reformation involves not just reforming, or somehow growing out of the sensibilities of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's also about recognizing how this heroic impulse. This is what the Islamic reformers refer to it as. In other words, part of the predicament that Islamic civilization and its expression in Islamism particularly has is this kind of deep focus on the dignity of Islam. And so this creates a heroic impulse, especially among zealous youth, at least a portion of the Islamic youth in their baby boom are moved to, travel from England to join ISIS. Because this heroic impulse is that there's a sense in which the rise and empowerment of globalizing modernity is it's humiliating. In other words, the deep sense of dignity that's embedded in this proud 1400-year-old culture it feels as though it needs to push back. It needs to reestablish its important place in the world. And so this sense of humiliation and the corresponding militancy to reclaim dignity, that heroic impulse, obviously it has pathological expressions in, suicide bombing and all kinds of horrific terrorism. It also can be channeled into something positive, right? That this heroic impulse can be turned to do what really deep down it wants to do, and that is secure Islamic civilization from being dissolved by modernity, right? Like a lot of the perception is that secularism means the abolition of religion. And, Islamic people are arguably the most religiously devout people in the world, right? As a large scale culture, right? They pray multiple times a day. And Islam as a religion, I think the best way to see it as a line of development in human history, just like all the other world religions. In other words, it originates, of course, at the traditional level, but part of this process of reformation that began, the Christian Reformation, the Jewish Reform Judaism, all of these moves allowed these lines to grow into modernity, to kind of have a modernist expression that, while still in tension with the traditionalist expressions, represented growth, and people could still identify and practice those religions within a modernist context without it being, without the tensions kind of disrupting it. And then, of course, these lines of development grow beyond modernity into post-modernity, right? So we have progressive spirituality, alternative spirituality. We can see expressions of all the world's great religions, some stronger than others. And Islam has managed to grow into progressive spirituality to some degree, as led by the popularity of the Persian poets like Rumi, his beautiful heart, and his poetry, as was demonstrated in the video that Namali was playing here at the beginning of the talk. And of course, Hafiz, I'll read a couple of his poems at the end. But if we look at alternative spirituality, right, we can see Sufism, we can see the poets, we can see some expressions of it within the milieu of progressive spirituality. Generally speaking, they're still, according to the Muslim reformers themselves, that the opportunity for Islam to become more harmonized with secular modernity and quell the forces of Islamism and terrorism within it, that's something that challenge is also an opportunity, which is kind of what led me to my thesis of the paper, and that is that this challenge of Islam among the world's great religions, Islam being the most resistant to modernity. In some ways, they're demonstrating loyalty for a deep level of theism, that devotion to the merciful and compassionate creator of the universe, that this ardent theism, which is really you can see it in all the Abrahamic religions, and there's theistic expressions of the Eastern religions, but Islam is in some ways unique in their theism, and this staunch theism is in some ways a challenge to us, which we haven't been able to deal with for, I think, many good reasons, civilizationally speaking. Understanding how this challenge can help us grow, both as a Western civilization, including modernity and post-modernity, and the integral or post-postmodern stage that's just beginning to emerge. All of these stages can have an influence, not by trying to persuade Islamists, although that might happen indirectly. It's more a matter of us taking in stride the challenge and allowing us to grow. And then as we grow, the extent to which modernity and post-modernity are acting like sort of a cork in the bottle, that's keeping the natural flourishing of Islamic civilizations from occurring, at least, in some ways they're flourishing, but in other ways they could be flourishing more, just like we all could, right? So I want to say a little bit about the idea of how modernity's emergence has, in a sense, been a major contributing factor to Islamism, right? So if you look at the history, you can see how as crimes of colonialism and the expansion of the European empires in the 19th century militarily defeated the Ottoman Empire. It defeated the Moguls, and everywhere this proud militaristic civilization was pushed back by globalizing modernity. And that, of course, created all kinds of tensions. And one of those tensions resulted in, or several rounds of kind of fundamentalist revivals within Islam, right? So, in the 19th century, we had the Mahdists, but then we also had the Wahhabi and the elements, the ultra-Orthodox elements of Islam that arose in Saudi Arabia, which still have a major influence on at least the Sunni Islam. I mean, it's very complicated, so I'm not going to try to undertake to analyze Islamic civilization too deeply. But they've been in reaction to modernity, at least parts of Islamic civilization, for a long time. And even when we had, for example, after World War I, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, we had the rise of Ataturk, as he's known, in Kemal Ataturk, who was a leader of Turkey, whose mission was to bring the Turkish people and the core remnants of the Ottoman Empire into modernity. And he was able to succeed quite a bit, but because of these remaining tensions, we can see that Turkey has kind of stepped back from their modernizing mission, and now can be more closely compared culturally and politically to many of the other Islamic nations. They're more kind of in solidarity with that bloc, especially of Middle Eastern countries. So it's important to say that an important part of the history of this interaction is the birth of progressive postmodernism, right? Which we can see emerging really since the beginning of modernity, but which becomes kind of democratized and popularized in the 60s. And in the wake of the 60s, there are many liberation movements, post-colonial movements. The plight of Islam becomes, in a sense, a celebrated cause within progressive postmodernism. And one of the leading figures of this emergent affinity between progressive postmodernism and traditional Islamism is seen in the figure of Edward Said. He was a Palestinian intellectual who became a professor at Columbia University and wrote a very influential book that came out in the 70s called Orientalism. And the thesis of his book was that the Western scholarship and academia was condescending, biased, that they had othered Islamic peoples, and it was a huge critique of the West, in a sense, on behalf of the victims of modernity, as expressed, in the Palestinian people and other elements of the Muslim world, who were the people that Edward Said championed. And Said was not just a champion of oppressed Muslim people. He was also one of the fathers of post-structuralism, right? In other words, he became one of the most celebrated professors at Columbia University, not just because of his book Orientalism, but because that book used the tools of post-structural analysis, right? Deconstruction, right? Postmodern philosophy. He was one of the pioneers of that. And so that, in a sense, cemented a lot of the love and the sort of the moral affinity between much of progressive postmodernism, at least at the academic level, philosophically, with the Palestinian people. So I think that this understanding of the crimes, or at least the the prejudices, the bigotry of Orientalism, as he described it, was real, and that was a wake-up call for modernity to stop being condescending, and that was part of this move toward cultural relativism. And so I want to honor cultural relativism because it has an important piece of the truth, and that is that if you have a view that your culture is superior to others, then that leads to all kinds of moral hazards, and as we see in history, colonialism, imperialism, the exploitation of third world peoples. I mean, so the crimes of Eurocentric hubris are well appreciated now by most people who are aware of this history. This move to respond to this really begins at the beginning of the 20th century with anthropologists such as Franz Boas and Margaret Mead, right, who argued that every culture is its own line of development, that we can't rank cultures, and that it's morally wrong for one culture to create a hierarchy of cultures in which it happens to appear at the top. And so some of the truths of cultural relativism is that we're all more alike than we are different, that everyone has a right to be who they are, right? Clare Graves' famous saying, that every culture deserves respect, that every culture in some ways is its own line of development, and that notions of cultural superiority have extreme moral hazards attached to them, as it even says in the Bible that God is no respecter of persons. Right? And I think we could add that God is no respecter of cultures either. We're all in this together and nobody's the other. Okay, so I want to just keep underlining that. But of course, cultural relativism has its own moral hazards when taken to an extreme. I would say it's actually in an indestructible polarity. As a value creating approach to world civilization, cultural relativism is one half of a polarity. And as we find with indestructible value polarities, that the value creating capacity of each interdependent pole is partially determined by the moderating influence of the other. So if we were to frame this pole as cultural relativism on one side and let's say cultural evolution on the other side, in other words, every problem is a problem of consciousness. We live in a world of trouble and suffering. And we, in a sense, have a moral duty to work in our own small way to help bring about the further evolution of the noosphere, for the sake of people who are starving, for people who are oppressed, for people who are struggling in various ways, with the trouble and suffering of the world. And so, if you look at this other side of the polarity from cultural relativism, and you say, okay, well, what are the moral hazards of cultural relativism? Part of it is that if we recognize that the world is, at least still struggling, if there's still trouble and suffering in the world, then we have this duty to try to make it better. And if we can't say what's better, then that duty is obviously going to be thwarted, right? In other words, is peace better than war? Is liberty better than slavery? Is prosperity better than grinding poverty? Is the equality of women better than a patriarchal society that oppresses women, right? Is recognition and acceptance of gay people, are cultures that recognize gay people as normal, everyday people who can be integrated in the society, are those societies better? Well, in some ways, yes, absolutely. I mean, we have a right, we have a kind of a duty to stand up for what's right. But the best way we can do that while avoiding the moral hazards of, hubris and this sense of superiority and this othering and all of the valid critiques that Edward Said made in his framing of Orientalism, that we need cultural relativism to help moderate the potential pathologies that are associated with wanting the world to be a better place. So I think what the emerging integral or developmental or postmodern step beyond the current situation that we have, a worldview that not only transcends progressive postmodernism, but also transcends and includes traditionalism, modernism, and progressive postmodernism, all three together in earlier structures of history as well, that this synthesis ultimately involves carrying forward the best and pruning away the worst of each one of these cultural structures, right? They all have very important values that we're not going to create a larger inclusive synthesis without. And they all have pathologies which I would say prevent them, at least to some degree, from enacting such a synthesis, right? So part of having integral consciousness, again, is having pride and shame. If you internalize these worldviews, you have pride for traditionalism, and also you're willing to feel ashamed for all of its pathologies. Likewise, with modernity, right? If modernity gets wiped out as in terms of its freedoms and its liberal values, I argue that that's going to prevent our further evolution. Without those liberal values in place that protect individual sovereignty and freedom, then we're going to keep collapsing back into authoritarianism. So having pride and shame, pride for the caring values of postmodernism, right? But shame for its excesses. This is the practice of the synthesis. This cultural synthesis of values isn't just a static proposition. It's a practice. It's an ongoing, oscillating integration, one value at a time, one situation at a time, one cultural opinion at a time. And it's an ongoing dynamic process. And part of the way this process is pursued is to, again, feel the pride and shame, not just in our minds intellectually, but at an emotional level, like within our heart. And that's one of the ways that we can have a planetary perspective and begin to recognize how every one of these worldviews, we can carry forward their values into a larger synthesis by loving what's beautiful and what's enduring, right? Like I said, liberal values, I would say, while they're going to continue to evolve, those are going to be part of the synthesis. We're going to need those, right? The caring values of progressivism, we're going to need those. And the deep loyalties and the devotions and many elements of the traditional level, right? Not just in Islam, but in the Christian and Jewish heritage of Western civilization. So having pride for that involves learning how to love it and love it in a way that we can demonstrate culturally that we're including it, right? So this heroic impulse to fight against modernity partially is a result of us inadequately integrating the gifts of the traditional level, and those gifts, I think, are quite evident in Islam, despite its militancy, which may, in some ways, makes it, at least for many people, the most repellent of the traditional forms of religious civilization. But that sense of repulsion is also, I think it's evident within Islamic civilization. I mean, they're attracted to modernity, they're attracted to, prosperity, and they're attracted to liberty, at least, especially their youth. But they're also repulsed by it, right? There's just something, decadent and decayed and vulgar and irreligious about modernity, and lots of that is true. So understanding that each one of these forms of culture have dignities and disasters, it's something that, at least within an integral forum like this, we can, I think, profitably discuss, especially when we kind of form the agreement that says we're not talking about the other, and we recognize our duty to love everyone and to affirm that everybody counts, and to use both an aspiration for noosphere evolution and a sense of respectful cultural relativism, both informing each other in a kind of iterative way. Okay, so let me turn now to a couple of slides. So these are the subheadings of the paper, which, if you haven't looked at them here, I'll just kind of use them as a way of organizing my kind of short outline of this paper. And so causes of radical Islamism, I mentioned those here in what I've said so far. And that while the clash with modernity is ongoing until modernity itself is able to evolve, until Western culture begins to demonstrate a better integration of traditionalism in general, and perhaps Islam in particular, then these tensions are going to exist. And in some ways, these dialectical tensions are never thoroughly resolved. They shape and charge these worldviews even within the cultural context of a synthesis, right? The synthesis doesn't try to just eliminate the tension. It tries to turn positive, negative elements of these dialectical tensions into positive expressions of them. And that's, in some ways, it's a philosophical practice. Um, and then, this understanding of the dialectical process of evolution, we can see how in history, right, we have the emergence of modernity during the Enlightenment. We could see elements of it in ancient Islam itself during the Golden Age, right, especially in Andalusia and in Baghdad. But the nascent modernity or modernism that we can see in historical Islam ultimately went under the waves of fundamentalism. It was sort of defeated, right? Especially after some of the difficult problems like the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols. But within Europe and America, the emergence of modernity begins this relationship, this dialectical relationship of the thesis of traditional Western spirituality, religion, and modernity. And this, of course, this tension, this dialectical tension, it characterizes the history of the West, right, for the last 300 years at least. But then after World War II, especially in America, we see how this natural dialectical tension was integrated, or the tensions were reduced more than ever before, because there was this sort of culture wherein traditionalism and modernism had been, in a sense, through the pressures of World War II, become very patriotic. It was very sort of the values of traditionalism during the 1950s and early 60s were very much in harmony. There was a strong cultural truce between traditional religion and secular modernity. But as those two came together and the dialectical tensions between them were at least temporarily alleviated or resolved, that created a strong thesis that then allowed this evolutionary motion of dialectical development to take hold, giving birth to the antithesis of progressive postmodernism. Right. So now, although the rise of postmodernism kind of re-exacerbated the tensions between modernity and traditional Western civilization, we have, for the first time in history, perhaps, these three major worldviews all online and competing within the culture war, which is one of the problematic life conditions that we find ourselves in, and indeed a very potent life condition for moving to a more synthetic cultural condition that can go beyond progressive postmodernism's antithesis to a synthesis, right? The pattern is there from the beginning of evolution with the Big Bang. And so while it's not a deterministic blueprint, it is a strong current, like an ocean current or like the Gulf Stream in history, that these tensions, not just the culture war in the United States, but the culture war at a global level, which, we can see strongly between modernism and postmodern. But we also see, as through the work of Edward Said, how, and now many other voices within progressive postmodernism, that again, much of this is happening at an unconscious level, but we could begin to observe something like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And if your focus is being in antithesis to modernity, right? If within many levels of progressive postmodern discourse, modernity is simply bad, right? We simply it's the polluter, it's the exploiter, it's the oppressor, it's the historical criminal, right? And many of the progressive postmodern critiques of modernity are valid critiques. And of course, then we have this conflict between Islamism and modernity. Progressive postmodernism kind of pours gasoline on the fire. It comes along. Al Jazeera, for example, for at least the last 20 years has been amplifying anti-modernist progressive voices, and these folks have become stronger and stronger in solidarity with the Islamists because they're both against modernity. Right now, again, we could think of lots of exceptions. When you're generalizing, it's always hazardous. But in general, I think we can see recently that this affinity between progressive postmodernism and traditional. I mean, the progressive postmodernists don't have affinity with Christian traditionalism or Orthodox Judaism, but they have made a strong political bedfellows with radical Islamism. And again, this is all understandable. It's all part of this conflict and the natural ways in which, not only do the strengths or the dignities of each one of these worldviews or structures of history, not only do they lend themselves to a higher level of synthesis, but their disasters, the pathologies of each one can amplify each other, right? So the anti-modernist hostility that many postmodern activists have is partially exacerbated by their sympathy for the evident oppression that is being perpetrated on many Islamic societies. And so each worldview is contributing to the problem, right? That is the traditional Islam, in its support for Islamism. Again, not all Muslim nations are the same, and you can't rely on Pew polls, right? The polling in these countries is very sketchy. But nevertheless, I think there's widespread general agreement that significant portions of the populations of especially the Middle Eastern Islamic countries, significant portions support violence in support of propping up or defending Islam against what they see are the dissolving factors, right? Modernist culture, it doesn't even have to invade, right? It's invading culturally. It's invading on the internet, right? It's showing Islamic youth what it looks like to live in the West, and that causes definite restlessness. As we can see, for example, in Iran, and other places. But again, you can't trust the polls. You can't point just to either protests or the lack of protests because these are not free societies, right, for the most part. But one of the lessons of a dialectical understanding of cultural evolution is that if we see in history what causes the next step to emerge, right? In many cases, it's when a worldview achieves the requisite success that it creates a platform for its own transcendence, right? So, it's out of the most successful versions of traditionalism that healthy forms of modernity can take root. If traditionalism is not strong, then attempts to create modernism continually collapse back into corruption and to debilitating elements that makes liberal values hard to gain ground. And so this at least this lesson from cultural evolution, we can see not only does modernity emerge from after the Protestant Reformation and out of the Protestant countries, which in some ways is a more successful version of Christianity, right, than the at least at the time the corrupt Catholic Church of the Renaissance and the Reformation. We can also see it in Japan, right? Japan had a very strong, successful level of traditional civilization. It had never been colonized. And so modernity springs, we have World War II, and we have problems along the way. But modernity was able to, Japan was one of the first non-Western nations to successfully adopt modernity and transition to modernity because their traditionalism is strong. So, and we can see the same thing with progressive postmodernism. Progressive postmodernism emerges in the United States as a result of the most successful form of modernism, right, in the 300-year history of modernity, right? After World War II and the prosperity that was delivered as in the United States, the sons and daughters of the middle class, they were the ones who embraced progressive postmodernism in the 60s. And it's modernity's success that gives rise to its successor. And I would say in some ways it's in places where progressive postmodernism has been most successful as a culture, not only successful in achieving many of the things that it comes online to help achieve, right? Making us care, making us be more self-critical, right? They're making us be more aware of the environment, making us demand social justice, all of these important gifts of progressive postmodernism. In the places where those are most culturally established is the places where the accompanying pathologies, right? The anti-modernism, the reverse patriotism, right? The militancy, the move toward identity politics, right? All of the pathologies of progressive postmodernism are most evident to those who've already been elevated in their own consciousness through those progressive values. So that principle of success giving rise to emergence is at least it helps us understand how helping is Islam become more successful on its own terms, more confident in its religious authority. I mean, not necessarily for oppressive purposes, but for the beauty that Islam has brought. Right. So this is again 1,400 years old, 1.6 billion people, a line of development, a spiritual line of development in history. This great world religion has been a channel for the spiritual experience of millions and millions of people for hundreds and hundreds of years. And as people have, lived their lives as devoted Muslims, and they've created some of the most beautiful art in the world. And so, when we begin to say, okay, there are certainly elements of Islamism and even Islam that are repulsive to Western sensibilities, such as the suppression of women, and we could go on. It's rejection of gay rights and human rights in general. Sharia law and it's all of its medieval expressions. It's important to sort of be honest about the elements that are indeed incompatible with modernity and progressive postmodernity. Understanding how there are these beautiful elements in there, and the window into the parts of Islam that are enduring, that'll exist for perhaps thousands of years, the window into seeing it through loving eyes begins with beauty, and then it extends into the truth, right? Because it's been a channel of spiritual experience for over 1,000 years, there's incredible beauty and incredible truth to be found within this civilizational line of development. And we can benefit ourselves, not just them, but ourselves, by better integrating, appreciating, and metabolizing the important values of this world great religion. So, the emergence of this integral worldview, or the postmodern synthesis, is not really culturally evident. It's still obscure, right? We're here, we're attracted to it, but it hasn't gone viral or mainstream at this point. And I think that I'm not worried about that, because I feel as though we're still ahead of our time, right? The life conditions are getting more and more propitious for such an emergence, and it's certainly emerged in some ways, but its time has yet to come. But we can see, for example, how avant-garde, or at least now rather emergent elements of Western culture have had a big impact, right? This progressive postmodernity, its rise and its values have impacted the Islamic world in very evident ways. And in the same way, if post-structuralist philosophy can empower many of the Islamic militants, similar developments, such as the rise of the integral worldview in the West, can also have an impact, right? Even though it's seemingly culturally distant. So these small little tropes within the culture in America can have surprising leverage on evolution elsewhere. And one of the ways that that can occur is through an integral or developmental understanding of spirituality in general, right? So I mentioned alternative or progressive spirituality, right? I don't use the term New Age because it's much bigger and broader than that. But the rise of progressive spirituality and its maturation into becoming more and more focused on non-duality as an important element of spiritual experience, that I think in the future, the rise of progressive spirituality will become to be seen as something similar to the Protestant Reformation, right, of the 17th century. And so this block of spirituality, in its embrace of non-duality, is kind of it's paved the way for the next step of spiritual development. Is that all the lines of spirituality that are growing through history, as those lines find recognition and expression within this emerging postmodern cultural milieu, these spiritual lines can, in a sense, reclaim the important lessons and enduring truths of theism, right? So in non-duality, was given a new birth and a new interpretation within progressive postmodernism, and I think what I like to call panentheism, which is the most sophisticated version of theism. There are clearly people who are within this progressive, this not progressive, but this postmodern, post-progressive worldview, that many of them are panentheists, right? While they might respect non-duality, their spiritual path, including my own, involves recognizing that this divinity is transcendent and immanent. And I'm not going to go into a whole exposition of panentheism, but clearly it's going to have a place within this emergent form of spirituality. And as it does, this is kind of rediscovering the enduring truths of theism in general can help us appreciate the staunch theism of Islam with new eyes and a new heart. And that same path of reintegrating, the truths of theism that have been, in a sense, the mythic, the patriarchal, the Old Testament, anger, all of the elements of Western theism that progressive postmodernism rightly rejected, I would say, that they had to push off against that. And so their aversion to the traditional heritage of the West is completely understandable and evolutionarily appropriate, right? In other words, if emerging postmodernism had embraced Christianity, for example, more than in its, small postmodern expressions, there would have been a huge risk of reverting to a pre-modern cultural context, right? They didn't want to go back to the old-time religion. They wanted to rediscover religion at a higher level, and that's in some ways what alternative spirituality did. But as spirituality in general continues to grow, theism's not just going away because it's directly experiential. The love of God is something that I feel, many people feel. It's a phenomenological reality. And so being able to reclaim it without the mythic baggage is a very important element that's going to contribute to the cultural vitality of this synthesis. And as we begin to recognize that there are elements of Islamic theism that we can appreciate more thoroughly and integrate more effectively, this can have a significant impact on our ability to integrate our own Western traditionalism, right? In other words, the fact that traditionalism is very much been alienated by progressive postmodern culture, and as progressive postmodern culture has succeeded in many important ways, and captured many institutions, and how many of the good people and, the educated people and the elite people have embraced progressive postmodernism in mass, that this has, in a sense, it's caused the culture war to become inflamed in the United States, right? That truce that I mentioned that occurred in the 60s and the 50s, that truce has now been broken. And we see the power of alienated traditionalism in the United States politics. It's a major factor that has led to the rise of right-wing populism and given us Trump. Trump has been in some ways the champion of alienated traditionalism. And until we can see that and see that we have a better duty to integrate our own heritage, we can kind of deal with this shadow of alienated heritage, this is going to have a big impact on the harmony of our own cultural milieu, right? So working to integrate Islam's traditionalism and our own traditionalism are really part of the same project. And so as as this synthesis comes online and postmodern spirituality gains ground, and its reaffinity for theism again in combination with non-duality, right? Non-duality is going forward, theism's going forward, and they'll be better integrated and mutually appreciated, I think, in this postmodern spiritual milieu than ever before. And that is culturally visible. At least it will become more and more culturally visible. And as it does, the that is not only will empower the radical Islamists who want to burn it all down. Instead, this move can empower the moderate Muslim reformers who seek to help traditionalism, Islam, grow, and recognizing that theological reform at the level of the religion is an important part of what needs to occur. And this has already occurred. There's been significant theological reform toward Orthodox fundamentalism, right? And as I argue in the paper, if Islam is the doctrines and teachings of the Islamic religion can move toward fundamentalism, they can also move toward modernity, or at least not become modernists necessarily. Again, they have their own path, right? I'm not saying that they have to become modernists, but clearly this tension with modernity and Western civilization in general is something that everyone would benefit from the alleviation of, right? If the next 9/11 is nuclear, that's not going to be good for Islamic societies. So, the Islamic terrorism is it's everybody's problem. And for those who love Islam and feel the heroic impulse of wanting to rescue it, right, from death at the hands of secularism, that very same impulse can appreciate how theological reform can play an important part of harmonizing Islam, even if it remains thoroughly traditional, with the globalizing culture of modernity. So, to conclude, let me just say a little bit more about what it means in terms of learning to love Islam. Um, First, this can be a grim situation. A lot of people are very exercised about this. So, in the paper, I include 3 cartoons just to try to lighten things up a little bit, right? Yeah, I have a cartoon that makes fun of modernists, a cartoon that makes fun of traditionalists, and a cartoon that makes fun of postmodernists. I just want to show those to you. Pardon me. So the first one you can see here uh, is the people in the hot tub. Maybe they're in Miami. They're drinking martinis, smoking cigars. The men and the women are in the hot tub together, and they say, "I think that if these Islamic fundamentalists got to know us, they'd like us." And I mean, maybe that's true, but they're kind of the funny part is they're sort of oblivious to the conflict or how Islamists would see them right there in their decadence. So the next one is, granted, actual music is a no-no, but where do we stand on air guitar? I mean, there's just something kind of funny about the sort of this at least potential naivete regarding what the problem is, with music in general and air guitar, right? Like this guy's going to start playing Led Zeppelin there, in the in the middle of their prayer session. And this one kind of makes fun of the postmodernists. It says, I certainly hope we don't end up offending Islam, and they're all crusaders, right? So, the progressive postmodernism, they're naturally, their culture is arguably more libertine than even modernity. And as their cultural norms are spread on a global level, they're sort of, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they're in some ways serving as crusaders in their own way. But again, some people may not find that funny. I just, trying to bring some levity to the situation. So let me just go ending here regarding, like I said, these windows, learning to love Islam, and just pointing out, in a very minimal way, some of the beauty, some of the world-class aesthetic expression that has come from Islamic civilization, and these are fruits of the spirit that demonstrate authentic spiritual experience, and that you can have a spiritual experience just by looking at a photograph, let alone going to Isfahan in Iran, where this building exists and where some of the most stunning Islamic art and architecture is still available for us to see and bask in. Here's another photo from Isfahan. I mean, it's just so stunning. And in some ways, it's the teaching of Islam that lead to this beauty, right? The teaching against images of humans has led to this extremely refined geometrical, artistic, mathematical expression that creates these famous Islamic tiles. This is a direct result of the teachings, and it shows this expression in a very beautiful way. The Taj Mahal, arguably the world's most beautiful building, right? This is this is an artifact of Islamic civilization, and one I hope to visit someday. I've certainly been impressed. The creator of it, he called it, a teardrop on the face of God. Even here in Spain, the Andalusian civilization, right? Part of the golden age of Islam. Here's an example of a beautiful art and architecture artifact. Even something as simple as a Persian carpet demonstrates the beauty that is within Islam. But it's not just the beauty, it's the truth. And so I just want to conclude this by reading two poems or excerpts from poems that have been, kind of westernized, translated by Daniel Ladinsky. This is certainly not a literal translation of the Persian poet Hafiz, but I'll just read them. All the great ones speak of the vital need to keep remembering God, so you will come to know and see him. That is why Hafiz says, "Bring your cup near me, for all I care about is quenching your thirst for freedom." I mean, this is a person who is, who knows God, who has direct spiritual experience, and he's showing it to us in a way that's unmistakable. Here's another one. Look at the perfect one. At the circle's center, he spins and whirls like a golden compass, beyond all that is rational, to show this dear world that everything in existence does point to God. So that's, I could say more. I've already gone on quite a bit. So let's open it up to discussions, comments, objections, anything that you want to bring up. This would be a good time for that.
Steve, Jeff here. I just want to say I'm just blown away, actually. I just thought that was really beautiful and a real integral transmission. And I wish you were on CNN, or the op-ed of the New York Times, or, to be able to actually have a heart for these various stages and various stops in human evolution, and an authentic transmission in their language and thinking. It's really something. And so I just want to acknowledge that and tell you that I'm sitting here a little bit abuzz from it. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, as Namali and I were discussing, before we started, an important marker of integral consciousness is the ability to, in a sense, champion the values of every one of these worldviews in ways that are at least as good, if not better than, the adherents of these worldviews themselves. So I'm not saying I'm a better proponent of Islam than, someone who's devoted Muslim. But at the same time, I want to be able to see it and champion it, to steel man it, to titanium man it, as Namali was saying, and so that's my goal in this paper and in this talk. And, but it's a practice that you can always get better and better at. And, being attracted to Islam and learning about it, I've traveled to Egypt and to Turkey and to the West Bank of Palestine. And of course, want to go to Spain. I want to go to India, but I'm attracted to it in a way that my heart can feel it. And again, this love, it's not nothing. It's in sense, the power that creates the potential for cultural evolution in the first place.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Steve. I really enjoyed it. Wonderful work. I'm interested in this. You referred to it, the sack of Baghdad, and it was about, I think, 12th century, maybe 13th or something, from Central Asia. And I think this is one of the great tragedies of history, actually, because at that particular time, I mean, Islamic society and culture was flourishing through the first translation movement. Have you got anything to say about that period when it seems to me that Islamic culture then was really because of the translation process and the houses of wisdom that were established all across the Islamic Empire, there was truly a really pivotal point in global history, and it's just such a great tragedy that with the invasion from Genghis Khan and so forth, that this was really wiped out, and it really set it back centuries. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, I could say more to honor the proto modernist civilization that was centered around the learning centers of Baghdad in the I could get the dates right, probably the 13th century, maybe the 12th century, but they had science, they had literature, they had so many elements of civilization that were such beautiful expressions that in some ways modernity could have easily emerged there first. Now, we could get into analysis and say, does Islam as a teaching, is it a foundation for modernity in the same way that Christianity and its teachings, there have been a lot of analysis that says that unlike any other world religion, that Christianity's emphasis on the individual, right? You're not just part of God's chosen people, that you're actually beloved and known by God herself, that God lives inside of you. That element of the dignity of the individual, some have argued, I'm not entirely persuaded, but there are unique elements of Christianity and its individuality that in some ways make it more conducive to the emergence of modernity. But certainly modernity can emerge within Islam, and it kind of did in an important way, although it didn't kind of break through in a lasting way. At least it didn't have the military resources to keep the Mongols from sacking the civilization and burning the library and bringing down all of these amazing precocious cultural achievements, right? And you could say that Europe's relatively greater success in keeping the Mongol invasion at bay, the defeat of the Mongols by the Hungarians in history, that is in some ways at least one of the explaining factors for why modernity emerged out of Europe and not out of Islam or China. China was also conquered by the Mongols. But again, I don't think we can put too much weight in our analysis of the dialectical development of history on this one devastating negative factor. I think obviously the rise of Mongolian civilization, we could probably identify some positives in there as well. So as Jeff likes to say, there's a certain amount of fighting our way forward, and sometimes it's a step ahead and then two steps back, right? Which we see in the case of the sack of Baghdad. I'm glad you recognize that history is still highly relevant today.
Yeah, thank you.
So, some time ago, so this is a question of why did Islam not participate in modernity sooner? And a PBS show, it says because they didn't have a modular alphabet. And the same thing with Asian languages. That English, well, I guess all of the European languages, all the letters are roughly the same size. And so they lent themselves to a movable type printing press in a way that Asian and Arabic letters simply didn't. And it was hundreds of years before somebody made a modular Islamic script. And then when they did, people didn't like it. And so Europeans were able to spread their written advancements far faster than anybody else.
Sure, I'm glad you brought that up. I've seen that PBS documentary. There's certainly some truth in it, right? But one of the things that you see in scholarship is that they can't explain the emergence of modernity, right? In other words, there have been all these different scholars who've tried to say, what was it that brought about this amazing emergence of the Enlightenment and liberal values and science? The science, every civilization has its science, but the science of modernity achieved more and became more powerful and has led to our current state, more than anything else. And so, why did this emerge, right? And there have been so many different theories, and then trying to narrow it down to some little tipping point like that, right? One more grain of sand on the camel's back, and boom, we have modernity, right? Heinrich in his book, Weird, right? Western, educated, individualistic, wealthy. I forget all the elements of his acronym, but he basically says modernity emerged in Europe as opposed to anywhere else because the Catholic Church banned cousin marriage, right? And so, I mean, no, it seems on its face, it seems ridiculous. But I mean, this guy gets a lot of attention, and a lot of people are saying, "Oh, yeah, that must be it." And so I would put that in the movable type category. It's an element, it may have been an important little piece of the puzzle. But if we're going to put all of our weight and just say, modernity emerged because we had letters that were more, usable in a printing press, I think that's just getting it backwards. I think that there's a gross misunderstanding of the process of noosphere evolution and this kind of grasping at straws to find the little key, this tiny little key in this big lock that opens the door of modernity. And I reject that. I think that emergence is partially unpredictable. If we recognize the stages of noosphere evolution that are recapitulating this pattern of evolution that we see since the Big Bang, where there are stages of development. They transcend and include each other. That they take up and use the accomplishments of the previous level, right? So that they're building a structure of integrated levels. And that's the same that we could say about noosphere evolution. Artifacts play an important part, but the emergence of modernity in the 18th century is a similar kind of emergence. I like to call it, it's like the Cambrian explosion in cultural evolution, right? And like, again, there have been attempts to describe the exact triggering mechanisms of the Cambrian explosion in biological evolution. It was this, and then it moved from there. I mean, again, those explanations are not all wrong, but they're missing the bigger picture of the fact that the emergence is unpredictable and something more is coming from something less. And to just explain it mechanically or deterministically or according to some tiny little tipping point, I think is to miss the grandeur of evolution, the spiritual teaching of evolution, that when something more comes from something less, part of it is miraculous. Part of it is the movement of spirit in history. And so, I think we can recognize these attempts to reduce the emergence of modernity to something small like movable type as attempts to try to, you see it in biological evolution, right? Trying to explain the emergence of humanity purely through Darwinian natural selection, right? It's just like, oh yeah, well, we share a giant percentage of our DNA with chimps. Therefore, we're just our bodies are only incrementally different, right? So we're just one species among many. And from a biological perspective, that's true. But if you look at world history, there's something that emerges that isn't the same, right? Like, some prominent biologists, have even said, like, the difference between chimps and humans is greater than the difference between chimps and worms. So there's some gigantic emergence that occurs that can't be explained in either material terms or deterministic terms. And I think that we can at least see part of the miracle of modernity as following this pattern of emergence. And while in some ways it's predictable, in other ways it's not predictable at all or explainable at all in those simple terms.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
I don't know that I want to follow that from Steve, but thank you. This has been very, I'm glad that I made it. I'm sorry I was a little late, but I wanted to follow Mark because from one engineer to another, speaking of numbers, you're both onto something, but maybe both and again, but I think it was in Baghdad in the ninth century. So I'm an engineer. I know that the numbers they're Arabic numbers, right? And they're Arabic, yeah, algebra came from Baghdad in the ninth century. I'm sure that's right. Their
Well,
numbers. So
actually,
that's probably
the
right. I don't
numbers
know.
the numbers in the zero are both from the Indian. They're Hindu. That's why they're called Hindu Islamic. They were transmitted to the West through
I see.
Islam, but they had learned that mathematical system from the Hindus.
I see. I wasn't aware of that. So I learned something more, even as an engineer, every day about numbers. But the alphabet makes some sense. But yeah, there's because I don't get English and poetry, and I know that some of these things are just at the surface beyond me. But the beauty of what they did with algebra, then, if you will, is in the ninth century is almost astounding to me even today. And the fact that the Franciscans taught me that if this is exactly correct or not, but that in most religious structures or maybe culture, I don't know, but Christ was as important as Moses as a prophet. And, I didn't know that. Steve, I just really appreciate like an integral view of traditions and cultures that I'm just plain naive and ignorant. That's all.
Okay, sure. Let me just respond to Jim and just say
Yeah,
that certainly we can honor the golden age of ancient Islam and their role in transmitting important elements to the West, their preservation of the Greeks, Aristotle especially, became, it was the sack of Constantinople in 1453. Many of the Byzantine scholars who had kept the light of antiquity alive. They fled to the courts of Europe, and it was because of much of the wisdom of Islamic civilization, especially in its golden age, that were important seeds of the European Renaissance. So that again, it's all connected. We're all in this together. And while we can see these dialectical differences and different expressions of history still extant in the current period, we need to give credit everywhere.
thank you.
Steve, I think you had your hand up. Did you want to share something?
Oh, part of my question actually was related to what Larry had posted in the chat, so I'll let him go.
Okay. Go ahead, Larry.
Thanks for bringing this up because I'm someone who's been curious about this for a long time. And here's what I can say now. You've introduced me this idea of these people, moderate Muslim reformers, Shireen Hunter, Nader Hashim, and Edward Said. And
Well, he's not moderate. Edward Said is a progressive postmodern and definitely radical, but go on.
Okay, so there's this concept of evident positives in Islam. And I'm going, wow, I don't know about that. All I hear is the bad stuff about militant Islam. So what I want to know is what are these enduring truths of Islam? And in fact, what are the enduring truths of theism in general, Abrahamic theism in particular? Because if we're all going to get along, we've got to have a common ground of a non-traditionalist appreciation of what deism has. And frankly, they got some explaining to do, Lucy,
I could say that as we look to try to harmonize, for example, science and spirituality, there is, as I have talked about in other talks, which are on the Developmental Philosophy YouTube channel, and as we sometimes cover in my monthly Zoom group, where we have guest speakers, and that's pretty well attended. It's that science is beginning. What we can read right off science, that there is higher intelligence behind the universe. That the idea that the universe is just an accident that is becoming more and more evident that that is a kind of a spiritual teaching, right? An anti-spiritual teaching, if you will. That secular spirituality, or not just atheism, but all the forms of spirituality that are committed to naturalism, all the explanations of the universe that are committed to naturalism. In some ways, they need things to be accidental, right? There can't be intention or purpose or mind behind the universe. But yet the very phenomenon of physics and evolution itself points to a larger purpose. I mean, purpose is within us, right? And the evidence for example, the fine-tuning of the constants of physics, right? How there's so many elements, the speed of expansion, right? The decay of the carbon isotope, all these elements of physics we're finding more and more, they're poised on a knife edge. If they were infinitesimally different, not only would life be impossible, but a universe of any kind would be, a complex universe of any kind would be impossible. And again, it's a talk in itself to talk about the elements of science that point to cosmic mind or some kind of divine purpose behind the unfolding of evolution. That to just say that it's codependent arising and to eliminate any kind of independent intentionality behind it, I think, is to turn away from what science itself is pointing to and what it's fairly evidently revealed. So again, let me just say one more thing. I talk about this in my forthcoming book, and it's an extensive argument for recognizing the explanatory power of panentheism and how those explanations and those perceptions are ultimately going to be part of any future spirituality, even though it might be pluralistic and include alternative visions.
Yeah, I want to hear people who are Muslims talking like that and add them to my video list and my reading list, because it's an empty spot right now.
So we need to recruit.
I got nothing good to say about it yet, so I'm looking for it.
Right. Well, and I think I also want to validate the resistance to Sharia law. Right. We're not going to go be dragged back into history. The achievements of equality for women, acceptance of gay people. These are gigantic civilizational achievements, and the things that threaten to pull us back into forms of a culture that deny those rights and those basic truths. We need to resist that with a degree of having pride for the achievements of liberal values. Right. That's an important part of the platform that we need to transcend.
Thank you.
It's excellent. I'll just read two quick comments here. Jasmine wrote, I arrived a bit late and newish to integral, but for Islam to grow in its traditionalism, what happened there? Traditionalism, is that because it needs to develop from its magenta red aspects more still? If so, do we need to acknowledge those stages too? Do you even think there are magenta red aspects in Islam, or is everything we're seeing more typical of amber blue?
Sure, that's actually a really good question. I would say first that Islam doesn't need to evolve. I'm not here to say that they need to evolve. They need to become modernists. They need to catch up with us. I would say, based on their own value of deep love and concern for their own religion and its place in history, for that value alone, the problem of Islamic terrorism is worth solving, right, for themselves, regardless of any damage it may do to us. So I don't want to be misinterpreted as saying that we all have the opportunity to evolve. And indeed, if we're going to evolve, ideally, we're going to all evolve together in our own way. That's what the synthesis offers, is a way for everyone to participate in a value system that validates all three levels. But certainly, if we look at the spiral of development, right? This understanding of worldview emergence as it occurs using this dialectical pattern that we see in history, we can see that that there are many elements of what I call pre-traditional, right? The color jargon is red, right? So pre-traditional warrior consciousness is the name I coined for it in my 2007 book. Warrior consciousness is still very strong within Islam. It gives it a lot of vitality. right? That warriorness, I think that, again, we have to carry forward the best of all of these worldviews, and that means carrying forward the best of warrior consciousness and its fierceness and its kind of single-mindedness. There are many things about it that are beautiful, although there are also many things about it that are antisocial. And as far as I can tell, again, being modest in my assessment as much as I can, there's still very much an admixture of straightforward traditionalism, which is the majority, but healthy or and unhealthy versions of pre-traditional, and that the dialectic between traditional and pre-traditional is much stronger in other religions, right? That is there's sort of a cultural truce. And when the traditional gets in trouble or in conflict, it can draw upon the resources of the pre-traditional, the warrior consciousness. This is one of the characteristics of Islam, is that it's a warrior religion, right? At least in many ways, and that's not all bad, right? That's part of there's some good in there that we can carry forward. Not that, again, we want to become militants or terrorists or suicide bombers or even advocates for Sharia law. But at the same time, we can come to appreciate the aesthetic beauty of Islam by recognizing how they're, in a sense, channeling and carrying forward elements of warrior consciousness that I think are going to be part of the vitality of this future synthesis.
Wow, this is amazing. I feel like we could have gone on for another 3 hours with you, Steve. It's really fantastic, and maybe this is a good time to bring it to a close. And what I'm also sitting with is the developmentalist challenge to love. And as you say, to love Islam. And I'm also just sitting, I'm really attuned as an immigrant who lives here in the US to just the heavy anti-immigrant sentiment that is politically alive in much of the Western world. And I would just simply focus on England, for example. England, in some ways, has this guilt consciousness that has, because of the world's biggest colonizer in some sense, to then to rectify that or to kind of compensate for that, to allow immigration to kind of go completely out of control, crazy as well. So in England and in many parts of Europe, immigration has become such a tough reality that they're having to deal with in a different way in the US as well, which is why we have Trump leading that battle cry in some ways. So, in England, for example, 150,000 people protested recently because immigrants in some ways, or migrants, aren't integrating to modernity. And that's a huge problem. And so the developmentalist challenge, as I see it, is as an immigrant myself, I can love their battle cry as well around this uncontrolled immigration that is causing the modern perspective and the worldview also to feel this repulsion around, wait a minute, like our values and our ways of living are being overtaken, colonized, replaced, like the great replacement theory that is also being, very much alive in the moment. It's easy to dismiss that as, oh, you're being racist, or you're being an Islamophobe, or you're being an anti-whatever. But I think the developmentalist heart in me, for some reason, like I'm fully capable of loving that as well. It is about loving the fear that is driving all of this kind of bumping into walls. There's fear in every worldview, in every stage. There's a fear to protect that, to want to protect that. And so this is really an incredible time. How can I love the 150,000 people in England that gathered against immigration? And much of it is against Islam in many ways, or the Islamist,
Sure. Well, all of these times, all these conflicts of history are still alive in the present.
Yeah.
And so the conflict that's been going on for 1,000 years between traditional Islamic religion and traditional forms of Western religion, this conflict's still occurring. And while, again, we can convert that conflict into a dialectical tension that can be carried forward into the synthesis, there's a recognition in which that that getting the fundamentalist Muslims in England to better assimilate into British culture, getting the Somalis in Minnesota to better assimilate into American culture. Again, it's not so much like these people have a right to be who they are. It's not like, oh yeah, they need to become us. It's more a matter of recognizing where the reform that's going to make these two civilizations more compatible can occur. And that can occur it can occur through religious reform within Islam. It can occur where within modernity, where we recognize that traditionalism, not just our own traditionalism, but Islamic traditionalism, that there's a permanent part of the structure of noosphere evolution that if you take that away, if traditionalism gets dissolved, the whole thing's going to collapse back. Same with modernity. These are achievements that are building on each other. And so we need those as a part of our, in spiral dynamics jargon, our meme stack, right? Our civilizational meme stack needs healthy versions of traditionalism because modernity can't exist in a functional way without it. Same with post-modernity and same with post-modernity, if you'll pardon the phrase. It requires the enduring contributions of all of these. And so this perspective by itself isn't going to solve these conflicts. A certain amount of fighting still has to occur, but perhaps it can be contained, and we don't have to have a disruption that can lead to war and other horrors.
Yeah. Loving and fighting our way forward, bumbling along. And,
in Jeff's famous phrase, yes.
Yes, and thank goodness for this developmental view and this developmental philosophy. So thank you, everyone. Certainly, there's a lot to chew on, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much,
Bye,
Steve.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye. Thank
Holidays.
you.
All tomorrow at Rosetta Hall.